Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm an English teacher and a novelist, and I'm excited to be talking to Mary Kendall again. She was on our show toward the end of 2024, and her new books are not necessarily connected with the Four Corners, but I enjoyed talking to her about The Bottled Secrets of Rosewood, which came out from Artemisia Publishing here in New Mexico, that I was just thrilled to have her back and talk about her new releases coming up. So we'll be actually talking about two books, The Spinster's Fortune and then The Accidental Heiress, which at the time we're recording this is a couple weeks from releasing, but by the time this airs, it should be out and available if our schedule stays on track. So I'm excited to have Mary Kendall back to talk about these two. So Mary, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, DelSheree, for having me on the show again. It was a pleasure the first time, and I am so glad that you invited me back. So as you mentioned, I am Mary Kendall, and I am a novelist. And I like to say that my novels are historically inspired. And what that means is that they all are rooted in some way in history. And a number of them are historical fiction, like the two we'll be talking about today. But then I've recently ventured off into contemporary fiction, but again, with those historical elements. And I'm a big fan of Gothic fiction, and I have been for all my life. So there's also some Gothic-y vibes in and out of the stories I like to think.
Let's dive right in. This series is going through a rebirth for The Spinster's Fortune, and then The Accidental Heiress will be coming out for the first time. So tell us a little bit about the premise for The Spinster's Fortune first, and then we'll jump into book 2 in just a bit as well.
The Spinster's Fortune was my debut novel, and it actually came out almost 4 years ago in April 2021. So I got my very first book contract in December 2020, and from there, that's what has led me to being a novelist. And so, like I said earlier, all of my work is based somewhat in history, and The Spinster's Fortune is no exception. It is based on a real-life event. And the way I came upon that real life event was by doing family history research of my own, into my own family. I was looking into my paternal grandfather, who passed away 10 years before I was even born, so I never knew him. But he had been a lawyer in D.C., and so his name cropped up in a number of newspaper articles about cases he was working on. And he worked on a case, and I discovered an actual photograph of him, which was a big find for me. I haven't really seen that many photos of him. And so, of course, I loved seeing the photo, and then I was like, wait, what's the story he's associated with? And it was about a so-called spinster who was in a poorhouse, and she had a townhome in Georgetown, neighborhood in D.C., that had been subject to looting, and vandals were ransacking it, and along the way, people were realizing, oh, they're taking treasures out of this house. So it turned out she wasn't a poor spinster. In fact, she had a lot of money, but the whole case was about how does something like this happen? And the real life event happened in the 1920s, late 1920s. I now like to think that my grandfather, I have to thank him for leading me to this story. I had the setting and I had the time frame, and because I have a love of history, I dove right in and wrote the novel from that point on. So this story is about Blanche Magruder, who is a spinster in the poorhouse, and it also brings in another main character, Margaret, who is a distant relative, and who they never really knew each other, but Margaret jumps in to try to figure all this out. So it takes place with dual narration for most of the novel. And we really get to explore family relationships as well as the mystery of what happened here with this situation.
Yeah, you really put a lot of different layers into this story, which was one of the reasons that I enjoyed it so much. And after reading Bottled Secrets of Rosewood, I knew I would enjoy it. I enjoy your characters and how you structure your stories. But what really struck me with this one was how complicated really everything was. The mystery, the lives of the characters, the history, the interactions between these family members, where this is a time period where a lot is kept in the family. and
Yes,
it's
definitely.
not
Secrets.
discussed.
It's all about secrets, really.
Yes, and they definitely
Yeah.
had a lot of secrets. And as you mentioned, you're kind of blending fiction with reality with the details that you were able to actually uncover and research, but that's not going to give the whole picture. And sometimes with historical inspiration, it doesn't necessarily fit the arc of a fictional story that you need.
No.
So, tell us a little bit about how you blended the historical facts that you found in with elements that really crafted it into an interesting and engaging story.
So I guess with all of the novels I write, they all start with a question. I want to know the why. I want to answer that question. So I feel like, especially in the case of these stories that are based around real life events, I feel like I need to know more. I need to answer these questions for myself. So that's where the structure starts. Now, in the case of The Spinster's Fortune, it's kind of like, now that I'm further down the road, what was I thinking? Why did I set myself up with such a complicated structure and narrative? And I'll tell you, afterwards, in the revising part of getting it ready for publication, I really had to go back and forth between those two protagonists to get it straight, to get it right. Because as you said, it's complicated. And it's so funny to me, because I've been writing for a long, long time, and I have many stacked on the shelves that nobody will ever see. So this was not the first novel I wrote, but it was the first one that was picked up to be published. And it's so funny to me that I took it on in such a complicated way, but yet this is the one that came out into the world. Now looking back, I have to tell you, I don't know how I did it, but that's what it is. And so I guess as I grow in learning the craft of fiction, a big part of it for me, not only as a writer, but as a reader, is to always be propelling the narrative forward. You don't want to stagnate at the end of a chapter. You want the reader to want to move on, to find out what's next. So I guess it's a lot of alchemy that comes into a novel, right? I mean, it's, as you said, the historical facts mixed with trying to keep it interesting, trying to keep the narrative going from the first to the very last. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the process that was going on at that time, I would say.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think from the reader's perspective, it definitely kept me interested and going throughout, and both books did. Part of that was, yes, the mystery, because I enjoyed that all the way through, and you have some good surprises and twists that we won't reveal here. But the character interactions were also something that really kept me interested throughout the story, because not only of the complexity and the time period and how that came into play, but you approach a lot of the relationships from a point that would be, especially for that time period, unconventional. And
Definitely.
a lot of the characters are not your typical what you might expect people to be during this time period. You have, Margaret, who is approaching 40, does not have children. She's running the farm that she has inherited and managing their horses and racing in that world. She's kind of got this husband who's
Kind of a ne'er-do-well.
Yes, causing some issues. And then she's brought in to learn more about the lives of these aunts that she didn't really know, who've also lived a different type of life than what would have been expected for these women at this time. Neither of them marry. They kind of live together in this just crumbling existence over time. And there's lots of questions as to how that happened that go along with the mystery. And we get to see, as things unravel, the older sisters and kind of how they ended up the way that they did. And then you're also left with this interest in seeing Margaret and how she got to the point in her life where she's at. And there's a lot of history for the characters that come into play. There's a lot of backstory that you've developed within the world of these characters. And some of it, like you said, the articles that you found, but a lot of, especially Margaret's side of things. It was really interesting to see how those pieces were put together, because you don't take, like I said, just that, here is what a family would look like in this time period. It's a very interesting and different starting point for these characters, which then does lead into the issues in book 2. So how did you go about developing the characters, particularly Margaret and her backstory, to get her to the starting point of the book?
You mean with The Spinster's Fortune?
Hmm.
The starting point. Yeah. So, like I said, in the newspaper articles, and maybe I didn't mention this, in the newspaper articles, I had a loose list of characters that were involved, including my own grandfather. You know, he was a minor character. So there was, like I said, a distant relative who stepped in real life in this story to help the real life Mr. Lance Magruder through this process. So there were a few details about this woman, and it was a woman. Her name was Marie, and there were a few details about her, not many, but I guess I just sort of picked that up and took off with it, and Margaret grew from that. Now, when I say few details, I didn't know anything. Margaret is completely fictional. I drew her up in my head to be what she is. But I liked the idea of making her a very strong female figure, especially at a time when women were not really supposed to present that way. I liked that, and I wanted to continue with her in that way, and I hope I achieved that.
Definitely, especially moving into the second book, The Accidental Heiress, where she's kind of left really having to pick up a lot of pieces and figure things out for her own interests and her life. And it's an interesting balance, I think, especially for the time period, because she comes off as very realistic. Even though she's a little bit non-traditional for the time period, she's the one who has control of her land that she's inherited from her father and the business that entails. And that was interesting, kind of learning some of the more legal side of that you touch on in the second book about the inherited property being different, because I had wondered about that as the reader. So she's working within the society of the time in a realistic way, but she's not that stereotypical character of having to rely on everybody else, having to bow in the face of what else is kind of going on in the time period. And that's often a really hard balance to strike. I enjoy historical fiction, and I've read kind of on all ends of the spectrum when it comes to female characters and how they're portrayed. And sometimes it really clicks. You're like, you know, these women find ways to work within their society and the rules and laws and traditions of that time to be able to hold on to their power and to do the things that they need to do. And then other times that can come off as unrealistic if women are doing things that don't work within what actually could happen within the time period. So how much did you have to research about the conventions and the laws of that time period in order to make Margaret believable in how she worked her way through the various challenges that she finds in the second book?
So first off, I want to say that something that stuck with me was a talk I went to a number of years ago, a talk put on by a historical fiction writer. And he was going through the process and how he approached it. And one of the things he said really stuck with me. And it was this: people back then, whatever the time period was, they were people just like you and me. They did things just like you and me to some degree. Now, of course, as you said, there were conventions and social niceties that they had to adhere to. But on the other hand, just knowing from my own family history, people got pregnant before they were married, for instance, just like today. So there were always things going on. So, like, in other words, I don't think when we're thinking about writing historical fiction, I don't think we have to look back and be like, oh, they were just very different from us. I think it's really helpful to remember that. They were people just like us. They got up, they put their pants on, etc. Right? So I think I started from that and also blended in facts that I know were true of that day. I have a family member that got pregnant out of wedlock in the 1920s and then got married soon afterwards to cover it up, as was something commonly done. I think I kind of wanted to roll some aspects that I know went on. Now, I think the difference was, of course, it wasn't talked about freely. It was covered up, and hence we ended up with a lot of family secrets that people still uncover to this day. So I think that's a part of it. But along those lines, I did also have to do research to confirm the legal elements that you spoke about. Was it really a case that a woman could inherit property? And yes, she could, in the state of Maryland, where Margaret is based. A lot of the research became really drilling down and finding out what actually was okay in her location. That was a part of it, too. So yes, there was some research involved. There was also just some understanding from my own delving into genealogy and family history of the kind of things that were kept secret and the kind of things that were covered up, but the kind of things that go on today and went on back then.
I love that point that people are still people, no matter the time
Right.
period.
Yeah,
I
it really stuck with me. And I think from that point on, it changed the way I started writing my historical fiction
Yeah.
when he said that. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the first people I interviewed years and years ago about her book, and it was back on a blog rather than audio. It was really the first time I had read historical fiction, and I loved the book, enjoyed talking to her, and she had kind of included some similar details of relationships that progressed beyond what society would have liked, in the time
Uh-huh.
period.
Uh-huh.
And she had made the point too. She's like, a lot of people don't realize that the majority of those marriages, especially in like the upper middle to high class, like weren't necessarily these negotiated contracts for better social position and stuff. She's like, a lot of those were somebody got pregnant and somebody better marry somebody real
Uh-huh.
quick.
Yeah. Yeah. It's human nature, right?
Yeah, kind of puts a different perspective on things. Where it's like you kind of have these stereotypes and these ideas, and it's like, well, actually, it was still just a lot of navigating the day-to-day human impulses and needs and trying
Uh-huh.
to maneuver around what society wanted versus what was actually happening. And I think that
Yes.
applies to both relationships, to financial matters, to different careers and jobs, and trying to negotiate a lot of that
Yeah.
regardless of the time period, you're trying to get through things in a way that benefits the individual, the family, the company, and a lot of the times that all goes on underneath the surface of whatever
Yeah.
is proper or sometimes legal, things of that
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
And
That's it. That's it.
it's really interesting to see those glimpses of how things played out in other time periods and find those connections of this is not something brand new to
Mm-mm.
2025,
Mm-mm.
These
Not
are
at
things
all.
that have
Not at
been,
all.
going on for a long time. And I think that's one of the things I really have enjoyed about your writing over reading 3 of your books now. The way that you're able to make characters who are very relatable and who I think readers can connect with easily because they may be in unusual circumstances, but they're still dealing with the same emotions and problems and complications that most of us have faced at some point in our lives. So I wanted to ask you about your approach to character development and kind of where you start with a lot of your characters and where you take that, how much you plan out, how much you just develop as you go. And with these ones where some of them you're basing more closely off real people and others like Margaret, who, you had a little bit of information that there was a female relative, but you had kind of more room to take her where you wanted to with that.
Yeah. Well, I guess first off, I really wanted Margaret to be a strong female character. I knew that. So I guess that was the starting place for her. And I would to add on to what you just finished up about, in addition to all the secrets and the things that can happen and people having to get married and all that kind of thing, I did also want to point out that we have always had strong women that have stepped forward and owned property and stepped aside from convention and did their own thing. I have a relative who I recently discovered who was the equivalent of a millionaire from Gold Rush country in California. And the story that's passed down, and she never married. She inherited her mother's money. Her mother was actually the one that went out to California, but then she took up with that inheritance and kept investing and was able to live independently and be a millionaire her whole life long. The story passed down in the family was she never was going to get married because she didn't want a man to take the money. So this is a story from the 1800s, and we can go further back. Margaret Brent, the first woman lawyer in 1640s. I mean, she was the equivalent of just a powerhouse. She literally was able to stand in court and make decisions. So I guess, in part, I'm looking back through history and thinking, yes, it's unusual, but they were there. Strong women have been there and have stepped forward. So anyway, to get back to my character development for Margaret, I knew that was my starting place for her to make her a strong woman. So then it was a question of fleshing that out and taking her through her journey and adding these things along the way, bringing in the legal documents, the court cases, everything that would plus that up and have her stay strong. And in terms of planning it out, I will say up front, I'm a pantser. I'm not a plotter. So a lot of times it just sort of comes to me, especially, I see that with character names. I don't want to stop the writing flow to sit down and think about what do I want to name this person. I just wait for one to pop up and run with it. That tends to be how I operate with writing.
I like that. I'm very similar in that. So
Yeah.
I get that process and how fun and interesting it can be as the writer to kind of get to know these characters as you go through and see where they develop and sometimes go back and fix things earlier once you know the character better.
Yes, it's like the characters sometimes have ideas of their own, but you have to let them do that. If you're going to adhere to a very strict plotting outline, do you lose some of that if they're changing course for you along the way? Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of times where, in the writing, you start to get a better sense of what that character would really do. They
Exactly.
really come to life in your mind. And that's something that I always struggle with. When I was in my master's program, I had to do more outlining and planning and all of that. It was kind of part of the class. And there are definitely aspects where I was like, oh, yeah, some of this I should probably do more often to save myself some time.
Yeah.
Less rewriting after. But there were also aspects where it was like, if I don't let this change moving forward, it felt like it was kind of boxed in and at times holding back the character. And that can be...
Yeah, it can stifle them. Stifle who they are as characters. Now, along with that, though, comes with the need to make sure in the revision stage that if you're not able to self-edit, then you have somebody looking at it and making sure that the character is staying true to who you have drawn them out to be. That's definitely important. And then, and many times when I'm revising, it'll be like, oh, that character wouldn't have done that. I got to change that. So, yeah, that's a part of it, definitely.
And that's what revisions are for. So,
yeah.
I always feel like, don't be afraid to go back and fix and change things later. That's part of the process.
Not at all.
Like, it's not going to be perfect the first time on the page.
Yep. It's all a part of it.
Now, in talking about Margaret, she definitely is a strong character, and I love watching her grow and develop over the 2 books, and I'm interested to see how she continues. But I did want to ask you kind of in comparison to Blanche, because Blanche also has a lot of strength, but she is living in a very different situation where she doesn't have some of the freedom or the just wherewithal to maybe make some choices that from the outside you wish she could have, that she could have stood up for herself or for, what she needed and wanted. She doesn't have those same opportunities and abilities that Margaret does, and that really impacts her as a character and in her arc of her life within the story in the first book. So I wanted to ask you about kind of the comparison of those 2 characters. They really reflect each other in a way that I think is very thought-provoking for the reader to really consider and think, how the situation that a person is in really can have a huge impact on what they're able to do and the choices that they're able to make.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess now, and this kind of contradicts what I said earlier, I think in part Margaret was able to step forward and be stronger than Blanche because of the time frame, the later time frame that she was born into and raised in. So there's right there an example of how being born at a certain time can definitely constrain you, constrict you. And I think that's the case for Blanche. She was born in the 1800s at a time when the expectations were marriage, a family, and that would have been her life. And unfortunately for her, things took a turn where that was unachievable, and then she was just stunted from that point on. Also, there's a layer of the family that Blanche grew up in as versus the family Margaret grew up in. Margaret grew up with just one sister. I see this in real life. When you have families where it's just a father-daughter dynamic as versus father and sons involved, I think that changes things in a family for a female. I think they have maybe, I hate to say that, but I think it might be more of an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that dynamic really can have an impact. And that was something that I enjoyed, especially reading The Spinster's Fortune and The Accidental Heiress back to back, and kind of having them both fresh in my mind to see those differences and comparisons. Like I said, it really puts you in a thoughtful place considering how people's lives are affected by the various factors involved: the time, the location, the family members, the societal expectations of that time. It's not a simple thing to say,
Yeah.
well, someone should turn out this way.
Yeah, that's right. And what's really funny is when I started writing these stories, I never thought they were going to be stories that were really more about family and family relationships. But over time, it feels like that's a lot of what readers pull out from them more than the mystery aspect, which is interesting to me as the writer. I didn't set out to do that, but if that is something that people can connect with, I think that's great.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
And it's a fun part of writing to realize, once it leaves your hands, it's really up to the reader to decide what it is for them. And we don't really have any control over that.
Yes. Yeah. I like to say once the book passes off for me, it's not my experience anymore. The
Mm-hmm.
reader's having their own experience with it. And that really has nothing to do with me. They're bringing everything about their lives and their experiences to the reading of it. And that may be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. Maybe they can't connect with the book because of something in their lives. And that's okay too. Not every book is going to be for every person, for sure.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, and I've noticed we're already just about out of time. That went extremely fast. But
Really did.
I did want to ask before we wrap up, you leave book 2, The Accidental Heiress, open to more. So
I do.
do we
I
have
do.
more planned?
In the back of my mind, there's a tentative plan, depending on, I really need to wait to see how this one's received.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about it because I think I took a little bit of a flyer with the things that you brought up. The fact that Margaret some of her choices are a little unconventional. And how's that going to be received by the readers? We don't know yet. So I think I'm going to hold back, see how it goes. And then I'll make decisions from there. Yeah. It's funny about this. I want to say real quick, I never intended to write a sequel to this. When this book came out, there was a book club, and at the end of those were the Zoom days, and at the end of the book club, they were like, "Well, when's the sequel? What's happening?" And I was like, "Sequel? What are they talking about?" I had no intention. I was like, "This is one and done." But then, as time went on, I was casting about for another idea, and I realized, you know what? People seem to like these characters. I have them already gelled out. We know who they are. I've got a whole thing. And then I came upon another story in my grandfather's career. And so The Accidental Heiress is another storyline that I was brought to and have to thank my grandfather for once again. So when I had this event that came up, this real life event that I came across because of my grandfather, I was like, oh, this is really something. I need to write about this. And then I had the framework already set in place with these characters. So that's how this came to be. But my publisher feels that The Accidental Heiress is not necessarily a sequel. They view it as it could be a standalone as well.
Yeah, they can absolutely be read individually. I highly recommend people check out both because I enjoyed both of them.
Oh, thank you for
But
saying that.
yeah, I do hope a third book ends up coming to light because I would really enjoy reading more of their story. But yeah, before we start to wrap up, let all of our listeners know where can they find you and more information about the books online so they can check these out.
So I like to make my website my hub of everything going on. So I have everything listed on that. There's a drop-down menu for my books. And the most recent one, The Accidental Heiress, is up for pre-orders now. And that website is very easy to remember. It's marykendallauthor.com. And that should pull right up on a Google search.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the show and chat with me today. I hope people take a minute to look up your books and check them out. I really enjoyed your writing and talking to you as well.
Thank you so much, DelSheree. It's really, once again, been a pleasure to talk with you today.